My name was Kalen Vross, and I have been screaming for 317 years. Not with my voice. That was taken by the thorned creeper that replaced my larynx in the second month. Not with my mind, though fragments of what I was still flicker like dying lumens in the meat that houses me. I scream through the DNA itself, through the code that writhed and rewrote itself in my cells, through the mutations that my children's children's children carry like sacred scars. The Imperium called this world Katachan. We who are fed to it learned a different name: the Devourer, the Flesh Garden, the green hell that never stops eating. But let me take you back before I became something that couldn't die even when death was all I begged for, back when I was human and foolish enough to believe in hope. Let me tell you how I arrived in paradise, and how paradise consumed me one cell at a time. I was 19 standard Terran years old when I boarded the colony transport Adamant Promise. 19 and already old by the standards of Hive Tertius on Morlock Prime, where I'd spent my entire life breathing recycled air that tasted of rust and other people's exhalations. The recruitment posters had been plastered across the lower habitation sectors for months. Brilliant green forests beneath golden suns, soil that you could actually touch with bare hands, water that fell from the sky itself instead of dripping from corroded pipes. Imperial Colony Initiative seeks pioneers, the scrolling text had proclaimed. Build a new world for the Emperor's glory. Land grants, generational opportunities, a future for your sons. They told us the Emperor protects those who serve with courage. I was conditioned to believe such things. Every child in the hive was. We recited the Imperial Creed before morning rations, memorized the litanies of obedience in the Schola. But standing in that recruitment line, clutching my assignment papers, I wasn't thinking about the Emperor or protection. I was thinking about my father. His name was Merrick Vross. He'd worked the plasma forges in sub-level 84 for 37 years, until the day a containment seal failed and superheated gas turned him into a shadow, burned onto the ferrocrete wall. They didn't even give us his ashes, just deducted the cleanup costs from our HAB unit credit balance. I was 12. My younger brother, Davin, was 8. We survived on corpse starch rations and the small stipend the administratum provided to orphaned workers deemed potentially productive. I remembered my father's hands most clearly. Thick fingers calloused from decades of manual valve control, always stained black from plasma residue that never washed clean, but gentle. When he'd had energy after his shifts, which wasn't often, he'd sit with us in our 3-meter-square HAB unit and describe a world he'd seen once as a child during a transport transfer. A world where green things grew without being engineered in vat gardens. Where you could see sky. Someday, Kyle, he'd said, his voice rough from inhaling forge fumes. Maybe you'll walk on a world like that. Maybe you'll feel real sunlight. That memory, more than the propaganda, more than the promises, drove me onto that transport. Davin was 15 now, old enough to work the forge shifts himself, earn his own rations. I could leave. I could go somewhere that wasn't the hive. I could honor the dream my father never got to pursue. The Adamant Promise held 12,000 of us. 12,000 desperate souls from a dozen different hive worlds, all believing the same lies, all hungry for the same impossible dream. We were packed into cryosuspension chambers, coffin-sized tubes that lined the transport's vast cargo holds like ammunition in a magazine. The last thing I saw before the suspension drugs pulled me under was a brass aquila mounted on the chamber room's ceiling, and beneath it, words stamped in high Gothic, "In service, salvation." I was taught to find comfort in such phrases. I tried to feel that comfort as darkness took me. I tried to believe my father was watching from the Emperor's side, proud of his son, the pioneer. The lies we tell ourselves to endure. I woke to the smell of vomit and the sound of klaxons. The cryo chamber cracked open with a hiss of escaping coolant, and I spilled onto the deck plating, my lungs burning as they remembered how to process oxygen. Around me, thousands of others were emerging from their own tubes, retching and gasping. The suspension drugs left a taste like corroded copper in your mouth, and your muscles felt like they'd been replaced with rusty cables. "Up, up, colonist processing in Bay 7. Move your wretched carcasses." The voice belonged to an Imperial Navy provost, a thick-necked man in a sweat-stained uniform, shock maul in hand. He and a dozen others were herding us toward the disembarkation ramps, like livestock, which I suppose is what we were. Through the transport's massive viewing portals, I saw it for the first time. Catachan. Even through 3 centimeters of armored plexiglass and from orbital distance, it looked hungry. The planet was green. Not the sickly phosphorescent green of hive algae or the chemical green of toxic runoff. This was a violent, aggressive green, a color so intense it seemed to pulse and breathe. Thick cloud formations swirled across the surface, and where they parted, I glimpsed what the colony primers had called verdant forests. From orbit, they looked like scar tissue. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The voice came from beside me. A man perhaps 10 years my senior, lean and weathered in a way that spoke of manual labor outside the manufactorums. He'd already received his colony designation badge. I could see it clipped to his threadbare shirt. Johann Kess, a G specialist, Zone 7, Tertius. "I've seen the briefing hollows," he continued, his voice carrying the hopeful edge I'd heard in my own thoughts. "Catachan's got some of the most fertile soil in the sector. The primers said one harvest cycle can feed a regiment for a year. My father was an agriculturer before the tithe took him. I know good land when I see it." I wanted to share his optimism. The Imperial briefings had been clear. Catachan was a Death World classification, yes, but that was merely an administrative designation based on elevated environmental challenges. The colony sites had been chosen specifically for their manageable threat levels. We'd been assured that proper Imperial colonization doctrine, defensive perimeters, regular patrols, adherence to the settlement protocols would ensure success. "Colonization is the Emperor's work," the briefing officer had declared, his voice amplified through the transport's voxcasters. "You are his pioneers, bringing humanity's light to the dark corners of the galaxy. The Emperor protects those who serve his vision with loyalty and courage." They told us he protects. They made us memorize prayers to recite when we were afraid. They conditioned us to believe our service had meaning beyond being a statistic in some administratum ledger. I nodded to Johann, trying to mirror his hope. "What zone did you draw?" 7 Tertius. River Valley, according to the cartograph. "You." I checked my own assignment badge, freshly pressed into my palm by a servitor at the processing station. Kalen Vross, construction labor, Zone 7 Tertius. "Same. I said. Something in my chest unknotted slightly. At least I wouldn't be alone. The provosts herded us onto landers, massive, crude things that shook like they were trying to tear themselves apart as they descended through Katashan's atmosphere. There were no seats, just crash harnesses bolted to the walls. 60 of us crammed into a space meant for 40, the air thick with the smell of fear sweat and recycled oxygen. Through the single viewport, I watched the green grow closer, larger, darker. The canopy wasn't individual trees, not like the holographic forests projected in the hive's propaganda reels. This was a solid carpet of vegetation so thick I couldn't see the ground beneath it. Plants the size of manufactorum spires jutted upward like grasping fingers. Things that might have been vines, except they were thicker than the lander itself, coiled between the trunks. And it was moving, all of it, swaying and writhing like muscles beneath skin. Emperor's mercy, someone whispered behind me. The lander hit something in the descent. I felt the impact shudder through the hull, then another impact, then a sound like claws scraping metal. The pilot's voice crackled through the internal vox, distorted and tight with stress. Brace for aggressive landing. Canopy interference heavier than... The transmission cut to static. The lander dropped like a stone for 3 eternal seconds, then jerked hard enough to slam my head against the crash harness. Someone's arm broke with a sound like snapping wood. The emergency lumens flickered, died, came back as dim red ghosts. We hit the ground at an angle. Metal screamed. Something in the rear compartment exploded with a muffled whoomp that I felt in my teeth. Then silence. Then, from outside the hull, a sound I'd never heard before, a rustling, slithering, creeping sound, like a million fingers running across metal. The assault ramp lowered with a pneumatic hiss, and Katachan's air rushed in. The smell hit me first. Not unpleasant. That was the horrible part. It smelled alive in a way the hive never had. Rich and dark, like soil and growth and decay all happening at once. Wet heat wrapped around me like a blanket soaked in warm water. Within seconds, my clothes were plastered to my skin with sweat. The sound was worse than the smell. Everything was noise, buzzing, clicking, rustling, dripping, calling, shrieking, 1,000 sounds layered so thick I couldn't separate them. And underneath it all, a deep bass pulse I felt more than heard, like a heartbeat the size of a planet. Move! Out! Establish perimeter! The Navy armsmen were already deployed, laser guns raised, scanning the jungle that pressed against the tiny clearing where we'd landed. And I do mean pressed. The vegetation ended perhaps 10 meters from the lander in every direction, forming walls of green so dense I couldn't see more than a few centimeters into it. I stumbled down the ramp, my legs shaking from cryo-suspension atrophy and fear. Johann was beside me, his earlier optimism draining from his face as he took in our surroundings. Zone 7. Tertius was supposed to be a cleared landing site, with prefabricated shelters already established by the advanced construction teams. What we found was 3 HAB containers, half swallowed by vines. A perimeter fence torn apart and scattered like broken teeth, and a landing pad so overgrown I could barely see the ferrocrete beneath the moss and creeping plants. And the trees. Emperor's throne, the trees. The smallest was 30 meters tall and wider than the lander. Their bark, if you could call it bark, was a mottled green-gray that seemed to shift and pulse. Massive fronds hung from branches thick as transit tunnels, each leaf the size of a hab unit door, edged with what looked like thorns but moved like fingers. "Where's the advance team?" someone asked. "The briefing said there'd be personnel to—" "There," one of the armsmen pointed. At first, I thought it was part of the vegetation. Then I saw the shape. Human-sized, suspended 3 meters off the ground, wrapped so completely in vines and moss that only the vague outline remained. Something had grown through it, using the body as a trellis. Bright red flowers bloomed from the torso. "Emperor, protect us," Johann whispered. The armsman sergeant, a scarred veteran with augmetic eyes, didn't even glance at the corpse. "Standard Death World flora. Nothing the perimeter can't handle. Colonists, unload your equipment. We establish the hab zone by nightfall. Anything outside the perimeter after dark is not our problem." They'd conditioned us to obey authority without question. So we obeyed. We worked for 6 hours straight, hauling prefab wall sections from the landers, setting up the basic infrastructure of what was supposed to become a thriving colony. The heat was like nothing I'd experienced. Even the forge levels never got this oppressive. Sweat poured off me in streams, and my water ration was gone within the first hour. But we were making progress. By the time Katashan's son, a bloated yellow giant that barely penetrated the canopy, began its descent, we had a perimeter established. 3-meter-high plasteel walls forming a rough square around the landing site, 20 meters on each side. Inside, we directed 4 hab domes, an equipment depot, and a water reclamation unit that was supposed to purify the local moisture. 187 colonists in an area smaller than a hive-block chapel. "Could be worse," Johann said, gnawing on a ration bar that tasted like compressed fungus and synthetic protein. We were sitting against one of the hab domes, watching the work crews string razor wire along the perimeter walls. "We've got shelter, supplies for 3 months, and resupply scheduled every quarter. Give us a year, we'll have doubled this space. 2 years, we'll have actual crops growing. My father always said the first season is hell, but if you can survive it, the land rewards you." I wanted to believe him. I tried to imagine this place in a year. Cleared land, neat rows of crops, proper structures instead of prefab shelters. A future that justified leaving the hive. A future my father would have been proud of. "Hey, Kyle," Johann said, nudging my shoulder. "When we get established, when we've earned our land grants, what's the first thing you're going to do?" I thought about it. Build something permanent. Stone, maybe. Something that'll last longer than I will. Prove we were here, that we mattered. "Good answer." Johann grinned, and for a moment he looked younger than his years. "I'm gonna plant a garden. Not crops, a real garden. Flowers, maybe. Things that don't have to be useful, just beautiful. My father never got to see anything beautiful." We heard the first scream 20 minutes after sunset. Katachan's night didn't fall. It descended, thick and absolute, like a physical thing pressing down from above. The work lights strung around the perimeter seemed to push back the darkness maybe 2 meters. Beyond that, nothing but black. The scream came from the western wall. A young man, couldn't have been more than 16, was staring at his hand. In the harsh glare of the work lights, I saw blood running between his fingers. Something bit me. There was something on the wall and it... The medic reached him first. peeling the boy's hand away from the wound. I was close enough to see 3 parallel gashes across his palm, each perhaps 2 centimeters long, deep enough to bleed freely, but not life-threatening. Barbed plant tendril, the medic said, already spraying antiseptic foam. Caught you when you touched the wall. You'll live, but keep it clean. Infection's the real killer on... The boy's scream this time was different, higher, longer. The cuts were moving. The edges of the wounds were writhing, the flesh pulling apart as something, dozens of somethings, tiny and segmented, emerged from inside the cuts. They looked like seeds with legs, each one no bigger than a grain of rice, and they were burrowing deeper, even as the medic frantically tried to dig them out with forceps. Hold him down. It took 4 of us to keep the boy pinned while the medic worked. The things inside his hand were moving toward his wrist, tracking up his arm beneath the skin. I could see them, small lumps traveling like beads on a wire. The medic pulled out a combat knife, sterilized it with a chem wipe, and started cutting. The boy passed out after the first incision. We held him anyway. The medic carved 4 separate channels up his forearm, pulling out the burrowing things and dropping them into a sample container. They clicked against the plastic like hail. 23 parasites from one touch. 23. Barbed devil thorns, the medic said when it was done, his hands shaking as he stitched the boy's arm. The briefing mentioned them, seeds coated in barbs that break off in flesh. They burrow toward the host's heart, pupate, hatch. If I'd been 30 seconds slower, they'd have reached his lymphatic system. After that, he didn't finish. After that, we learned later, they'd have laid eggs in his major organs. He'd have been a breeding ground, conscious until they hatched and consumed him from inside. The boy lived, if you could call it living. His arm never worked right after that, the muscle and nerve damage too severe. But he was one of the lucky ones. We lost 6 people that first night. 1 guard fell asleep on watch. The heat and exhaustion simply overwhelmed him. Something came over the wall, something none of us saw clearly. We found him at dawn, his body deflated like an empty water bladder, every drop of fluid drained through a single puncture wound at the base of his skull. 2 others died when they went to use the sanitation unit at the edge of the compound. The unit's waste pipe led outside the perimeter. Standard design. Something followed the pipe back. They didn't even have time to scream. The remaining 3 violated protocol, ventured outside the perimeter to retrieve a supply crate that had been dropped 50 meters from the wall during unloading. The armsmen found pieces of them at dawn, scattered across 20 meters of jungle floor. The pieces were already being consumed by the moss, tendrils growing into the meat, rooting the remains to the soil. At sunrise, the Imperium's message was clear. Katachan didn't care about our protocols or our prayers. The conditioning that had taught me the Emperor watches over the faithful meant nothing here. The perimeter wasn't protection, it was just a slower death. But we didn't have a choice. The adamant promise was already gone, departed during the night to deliver colonists to other hell worlds. Resupply wasn't scheduled for 3 standard months. We had no Vox powerful enough to reach the system's relay stations through Katachan's atmospheric interference. We were alone with the jungle, and it was so very, very hungry. By the end of the first week, 17 more colonists were dead. By the end of the second week, 43. By the end of the first month, we'd lost 91 of our original 187. Nearly half. The jungle killed in ways the Imperial briefings never mentioned. It killed with spores that you couldn't see until you were coughing blood, your lungs becoming gardens for fungal bloom. It killed with insects that laid eggs in your eyes while you slept, the larvae eating your optic nerve before they hatched. It killed with vines that grew 2 meters in a night, crushing structures, piercing walls, finding flesh. One morning I woke to find a thin tendril growing through the wall of the Heb dome, its tip resting against my calf. The skin beneath it had turned black. If I'd slept another hour, the medic said, the nerve toxin would have reached my spine. We burned our dead. Not ceremony. Practicality. Burial was impossible. Anything in the ground became fertilizer for the plants, and they grew faster when fed human remains. The funeral pyres ran day and night, the smell of burning flesh mixing with the jungle's rot-sweet perfume. Johann's optimism died somewhere in the 3rd week. I watched it leave him in stages. First the easy smile, then the habit of talking about future harvests. Finally, the light in his eyes. By week 4, he moved like a servitor, automatic, responsive only to immediate stimulus, already rehearsing for death. But my body didn't die. Instead, it started changing. It began with pain, not the sharp pain of injury that I knew I'd lived with in the hive. This was different. Deep, bone-level pain, like my skeleton was trying to tear free of my flesh. It started in my legs and back, a constant ache that made sleep impossible. Growing pains, the medic said when I reported it. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much death, too fast. You're 19, yeah? Male bodies sometimes have a second growth phase under extreme stress. The pain should pass. It didn't pass. It got worse. My boots stopped fitting in the 2nd month. Not gradually. Overnight. I woke one morning and couldn't force my feet into them. My feet had widened by nearly 3 centimeters, the bones spreading like they were being pulled apart from inside. I wasn't the only one. The younger colonists, anyone under 25, were experiencing similar changes. Hands getting larger, shoulders broadening, bones thickening. Adaptive mutation, the medic finally admitted in the 6th week. By this point, only 73 of us remained alive. The local environment is saturated with mutagens. In the water, the air, the food. Everything on Catachan carries genetic corruption. The plants, the animals, even the soil itself. Our bodies are trying to adapt or die. He said it like it was routine, like our DNA rewriting itself was just another hazard to endure. The muscle came next. I'd always been lean, hive-thin, built from minimal rations and maximum labor. But by the 3rd month, my arms were corded with muscle I hadn't earned. When I looked at my reflection in a polished surface, I barely recognized myself. My shoulders were twice as wide. My hands could palm a man's skull. The veins in my arms stood out like cables. It hurt. Every moment of every day, my body felt like it was tearing itself apart and rebuilding wrong. I could feel my bones thickening, my muscles bunching, my ligaments stretching. At night, I'd lie in the Hab dome, listening to my body creak like strained metal. Johann changed too. The lean agriculturer became something broader, heavier. His hands developed calluses so thick they looked like armor plate. When he gripped a tool, the metal groaned. "This isn't natural," he said one night, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. "We're becoming something else. We're surviving, I said. Because that's what I'd been conditioned to believe. That the Imperium's servants endure, that adaptation is strength, that suffering has meaning. The lies got easier to tell as I became less human to hear them. The food was the worst part. The supplies from orbit ran out in the second month, faster than planned because so many had died in the first weeks. But not fast enough. After that, we had to eat what Katashan provided. The plants were technically edible. The Imperium's taxonomy classified several species as nutritionally sufficient for human consumption. What they didn't mention was the taste, bitter and acrid, like chewing on chemical runoff. Or the effects. Every meal of native vegetation brought changes. I could feel them happening. My tongue became less sensitive to bitter compounds. My stomach stopped rejecting the toxins that should have killed me. My liver processed poisons that would have liquefied a hive welder's organs. I was becoming something that could eat Katashan's flesh without dying. The realization came slowly. We weren't colonizing this world, it was colonizing us, rewriting our DNA one meal at a time, reshaping our bodies to suit its needs, not ours. And we had no choice but to let it happen, because the alternative was death, and I was still human enough to fear that. Still human enough. For now. The resupply drop never came. 3 months after planetfall, we waited at the landing site, watching the sky. The adamant promise should have returned, should have brought fresh supplies, medical equipment, maybe even news that the Imperium hadn't forgotten us. The sky remained empty. 1 week past the scheduled drop, we finally received a transmission. Not targeted. Just the automated broadcast the Imperial Navy sent to all colony worlds, cycling through calm frequencies. The message was fragmented, distorted by Katashan's magnetic interference, but we caught enough. Cadian Gate. Massive warp incursion. All available vessels redirected. Colony resupply suspended indefinitely. Emperor protects. Then static. Then nothing. We were alone, truly alone, no resupply, no rescue, no contact with the Imperium that had sent us here. That's when Johann tried to kill himself. I found him in one of the storage units, a monomolecular wire wrapped around his neck. He'd tied one end to a support beam and was pulling the other end tight with both hands. The wire was already cutting into his skin, blood running down his chest. Johann! Stop! I grabbed his hands, tried to pull them away. He fought me. We crashed into storage crates, scattering equipment. He was strong. We all were now, our bodies rebuilt by Katashan's mutagens. But I was stronger. I got the wire off his neck, threw it across the room. He collapsed, sobbing, not like a grown man, like a child. Huge heaving sounds that came from somewhere deeper than lungs. I can't, he gasped. Kael, I can't. This isn't living. This is just dying slowly. We're never leaving. We're never... His voice broke. My father died in a forge accident. 12 seconds of fire. He didn't suffer. But this goes on forever. I can't do forever. I held him while he cried. I wanted to tell him it would be okay, that rescue would come, that the Emperor was watching over us, that our suffering had meaning, that faith would sustain us. But I couldn't, because somewhere in the previous months, as my body was reshaped, something else had changed too. The conditioning was failing. The prayers I'd memorized as a child sounded like empty words. The Imperial Creed felt like propaganda. The promises of divine protection rang hollow when I'd watched good people die screaming while parasites ate them from inside. They told us the Emperor protects. Every day on Katashan proved that was a lie, told to keep us compliant. We survive, I finally said. That's all we can do. We survive. Johann looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. Why? For what? I didn't have an answer. By the end of the second year, only 41 colonists remained. But something interesting had happened. We'd stopped dying. Not because we'd beaten Katachan. You don't beat Katachan, but because we'd changed enough that it couldn't kill us easily anymore. Our bodies had adapted to the toxins, the parasites, the spores. Our reflexes had quickened. Our senses had sharpened. We could hear the rustle of a Katachan devil in the underbrush from 50 meters away. We could smell the sweet rot scent of brain leaf fungus before it released its spores. We'd become something new, something that could exist in this hell, but the cost was written in how we thought. I noticed it first in my dreams. They were different now. Not the scattered, illogical narratives of normal sleep, but procedural evaluations, threat assessment algorithms running while I slept. My unconscious mind cataloging the thousands of ways Katachan could kill me, calculating survival probabilities, adjusting my behavior patterns. I dreamed in tactics, in survival strategies, in threat matrices. When I woke, I found myself doing the same things. Everything was evaluated through a survival filter. That plant, edible or poison. That sound, predator or prey. That shadow, threat or shelter. I stopped remembering my father's face. Not intentionally, it just slipped away. When I tried to recall it, all I got was a blur. The memory of his hands remained, but even that was fading, becoming less emotional, more observational. Rough texture, melanin concentration, scar patterns. Johann stopped talking about his father entirely. Stopped talking much at all, actually. None of us did. Language became purely functional. Warnings, status reports, minimal necessary communication. We didn't have conversations anymore. We exchanged survival data. Northeast quadrant, breacher trails, 3, maybe 4. Avoid. Water reclamation at 40%. Need new filter substrate. Torres is coughing blood. Lung rot. Won't last the week. Torres didn't last the week. We burned him like we'd burned all the others. I watched his body blacken and curl in the flames and felt nothing. He'd become a resource loss, a reduction in group capability, a statistic. When had I stopped seeing him as human? When had I stopped seeing myself as human? The children changed everything. By the 7th year, our population had stabilized at 38 survivors. We'd learned the patterns, adapted to the threats, carved out a sustainable existence in our tiny perimeter. We weren't thriving, but we weren't dying either. That's when the first child was born. His name was Garrett. His father, Michaels, was one of the original colonists. His other father, Raoul, was a former hive-ganger who'd taken the colony option instead of execution. The Imperium's gene labs had made it possible. They needed colonists, and traditional family structures were inefficient when half the colonists might be male. So they had adapted. Artificial wombs. Genetic material from 2 donors. Population increase through industrial methods. I was there when Garrett emerged from the gestation pod, 9 months after Michaels and Raoul had submitted their genetic material to the colony's medical fabricator. The pod cracked open, and the medic, not the original one, he died in year 3, pulled out a squalling infant. An infant that didn't look quite human. His arms were too long, his fingers were too thick, his eyes were too far apart, and his skin had a faint greenish tint that none of us mentioned, but all of us saw. "Healthy male," the medic announced. 10 fingers, 10 toes, elevated muscle density and bone structure, but within acceptable parameters for second-generation Catachan natives. Second-generation Catachan natives. That's what we were now. No longer colonists, but natives. The planet had accepted us by reshaping us. We'd paid the price of admission in DNA. More children came. By year 10, we had 17 of them. By year 15, 43. And with each generation, they looked less like humans from the Imperium's core worlds and more like something Catachan had designed. The third generation was when I understood what we'd done. They were born stronger than their parents. Faster, more aggressive. Their senses were sharper. They could track scents we couldn't detect, hear frequencies we couldn't process. They could eat plants that would poison us. They could survive injuries that would kill us. They were better adapted to Catachan than we were. But they were also less emotional, less creative, less curious about anything beyond survival. They didn't ask questions about the stars or wonder what lay beyond Catachan's killing jungles. They existed in an eternal present tense, focused entirely on the immediate requirements of staying alive. They were perfect soldiers, perfect survivors, perfect tools, and I'd helped make them. By year 15, I wasn't working construction anymore. I was teaching the third generation how to kill, how to track Catachan devils through the undergrowth, how to identify ambush predators by the pattern of broken branches, how to move silently through terrain that would shred an unprepared human, how to fight with knives, because ammunition was a luxury and close combat was certainty. I was good at it. We all were. The survivors. We'd learned by losing people, by trial and error written in the blood of those too slow or unlucky. Now we were passing that knowledge to children who absorbed it like sponges soaking up water. "Why do we practice the killing drills, Teacher Voss?" one of them asked me. A boy named Harkin, maybe 7 years old, already taller and broader than I'd been at 12. "Because everything on Catachan wants to kill you," I told him, "so you learn to kill it first." "But why do things want to kill us?" I looked at him, tried to remember what it felt like to ask why instead of just accepting. The memory was faint, like something from another person's life. "Because that's how Catachan works," I said. "Nothing here exists that doesn't kill or get killed. You're either predator or prey. We taught you to be predators." He nodded, satisfied. He didn't ask about purpose or meaning or whether there was more to life than survival. He'd been born here. He didn't know there could be anything else. I'd helped create a generation that couldn't imagine anything beyond Catachan's green hell. We'd adapted them so completely to this environment that they couldn't survive anywhere else. Not physically and not mentally. We'd made them into perfect slaves for the planet that had enslaved us. The Imperial transport arrived without warning on a morning that started like any other. I was 66 years old, but looked 40. Catachan's mutations had done that, extended our functional lifespan, kept our bodies operating past normal human parameters. I'd watched friends age and die in the hive by 50. Here, I was still as strong as I'd been at 30, still capable of hunting, fighting, teaching, still trapped in flesh that refused to release me. The transport came down on thrusters that scorched the landing pad to slag, armored and brutal, built for war zones. Its boarding ramp crashed down, and 200 Imperial Guardsmen marched out in perfect formation, laser guns at ready, scanning for threats. Behind them came an officer, not guard, administratum. Crisp uniform, data slate, cold eyes that evaluated us like livestock. We'd gathered near the perimeter, about 300 of us now, including the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. 47 years of desperate survival, 47 years of adaptation, 47 years of becoming something the Imperium no longer recognized as entirely human. The officer looked us over with barely concealed disgust. I understood why. We were huge. Even the smallest adults topped 2 meters. Our bodies were scarred, muscled like industrial equipment, covered in calluses and healed wounds. We wore clothing made from Katashan flora, because our supplies had run out decades ago. We carried weapons we'd crafted from bone and stone and salvaged metal. We looked like barbarians, like savages, like something that needed civilizing. "I am Administratum Prefect Halorn," the officer announced, his voice amplified by Vox bead. "By order of the Imperial Governor of the Katachan system, this colony has been designated compliant. Population census indicates sufficient numbers for tithe assessment. All males between the ages of 14 and 45 report to the transport for processing." I didn't understand. Not immediately. "Tithe. We're colonists. We've fulfilled our contracts through contracts." Halorn's laugh was sharp and brief. "You were seeded here 47 years ago as part of the Katashan Regimentation Program. Deathworld colonization is the Imperial Guard's primary recruitment method for Katashan stock. This world produces the galaxy's finest jungle fighters because the weak die and the strong adapt. You fulfilled your purpose. Now your sons will serve." And I understood. We'd never been colonists. The posters, the promises, the land grants, all lies. We were breeding stock, seeds planted in hell to see what would grow. The Imperium had sent us here to die or adapt, and our adapted children were the harvest. "Katashan regiments require constant reinforcement," Halorn continued, consulting his data slate. "Deathworld infantry suffers 97% casualties within first year of active deployment. Current quotas require 2,000 recruits per standard year. This colony's assessment is 147 combat-age males, processed immediately. 147, every man who'd survived childhood, every son we'd raised, taught, shaped to endure Katashan's hell." "No," the voice was Johann's. He was old now, truly old, one of the few who'd made it this far. But his voice was still strong. "No, you don't get to take them. They're not soldiers. They're—" The closest guardsman struck him across the face with a rifle stock. Johann fell hard, blood streaming from his split cheek. "Compliance is not optional," Halorn said. "Refusal to meet tithe requirements is heresy. The penalty is—" "We'll go." The voice came from Harkin, no longer the 7-year-old I'd taught to kill. Now a man of 32, massive and scarred, eyes hard as stone. Behind him stood every combat-age male in the colony. "We'll go," he repeated. "We're soldiers. That's what you made us for." And they went. They marched onto that transport with their heads high and their backs straight, weapons confiscated, chains locked around their wrists. My students Johann's sons, Michael's grandchildren, the harvest we'd grown in our own flesh. The transport lifted off, taking 147 lives to feed the Imperium's endless wars. Halorn remained long enough to file the compliance documentation and inform us that another harvest would be required in 15 years. Then he left too. We stood in the silence, those of us too old or too young to take. The children looked at their fathers and brothers disappearing into the sky and asked when they'd return. I didn't tell them the truth, that Katashan regiments have a 97% casualty rate in the first year, that those men would die on worlds whose names we'd never know, fighting enemies we'd never hear about, serving an emperor who'd never cared we existed. I didn't tell them that we'd spent 47 years preparing them for that death. I didn't tell them that the lies I'd been taught, the emperor protects, service brings honor, sacrifice has meaning, had metastasized into new lies. Teach your children to survive, and they'll build something better. We'd built nothing. We'd just processed raw materials for the Imperium's war machine. And in 15 years, they'd come back for the next harvest. I have been screaming for 317 years. The Imperium came every 15 to 20 years, regular as clockwork, taking their harvest of adapted flesh. My body refused to die. The mutations we'd acquired extended lifespans far beyond normal human parameters. I watched generations rise and be harvested. I taught thousands of children how to survive Katashan so they could die on distant worlds. And I couldn't stop, because if I stopped teaching, they'd die on Katashan instead. At least dying in service to the Imperium meant their deaths had purpose, or so I told myself. The lies evolved, adapted, survived, just like we did. Johann died in year 63. Not to Katashan. His adapted body was too resilient. He simply laid down one night and didn't wake up. I think his mind just decided it was done. Decided 317 years was long enough to watch his descendants marched onto transports. I envied him. I tried to follow his example, but my body wouldn't release me. I tried hanging in year 70. My neck muscles were too strong. The rope broke. I tried poison in year 92. My liver processed it, turned it into nutrients. I tried walking into the jungle and letting Katashan take me in year 108. I survived for 6 months in the deep green, killing everything that tried to kill me, until guilt drove me back to teach the next generation. I couldn't die. Katashan had made me too perfect a survivor. By year 200, I'd stopped counting the harvests. By year 250, I'd stopped learning names. By year 300, I was a living fossil, a remnant of the first generation, teaching my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren how to become products for the Imperium's consumption. And today, 317 years after I stepped off the adamant promise, I stand at the perimeter watching another transport descend. The children gather around me. They always do. I'm Old Voss now, the Ancient One who remembers the before times, who speaks in old words they don't understand. They ask me to tell stories while we wait for the harvest. Teacher Voss, one asks, a boy of maybe 9, already tall and lethal. What's it like? The stars? Other worlds? I try to remember, try to pull up memories of the hive, of my father, of standing on a transport deck looking at Katashan from orbit. But the memories are corrupted data, fragments that don't assemble into coherent images. Different, I finally say. Not better. just different. The priests say the Emperor watches over us, another child says. This one's maybe 12. Female. Yes, they exist now, adapted and lethal as the males. They say we serve his grand purpose. Is that true? I look at her. See the indoctrination already taking root. The new priests who arrived in year 180, establishing a proper cult of the Emperor among the colony. Teaching the children the same lies I'd been taught. The Emperor protects. Service is honor. Sacrifice is glory. The priests say many things. I tell her, you'll have to decide for yourself what's true. It's the most heresy I can manage. I've become a coward in my centuries, too worn down to rebel, too adapted to the system to break it. The transport lands, the administratum prefect emerges. A different one they rotate through, but they're all the same. Same uniform, same data slate, same cold evaluation of human resources. Harvest quota, he announces. 192 combat-age individuals processed immediately for deployment to Armageddon war zone. Armageddon. I know that name. Orc invasion, meat grinder, 100-year war. Most of these children will be dead in weeks, but they march onto the transport anyway, because we taught them to. Because we shape them into perfect soldiers who obey without question, who see death as inevitable, who exist only to serve a system that devours them. The transport lifts off. The children wave goodbye to their siblings and parents. They'll cry for a few days, then move on. By the time they're old enough for harvest, they'll have forgotten this batch. It's more efficient that way. The cycle continues. A month after the harvest, a new transport arrives. Not harvesting this time, planting. The boarding ramp lowers and they stumble out. 300 fresh colonists from whatever hive worlds the Imperium is draining this decade. They look exactly like I did 317 years ago. Young, hopeful, believing the lies about land grants and new opportunities. Believing the Emperor protects. They see our colony, permanent structures now, built from stone and Katashan timber, defensive perimeters that actually work. They see us, massive and scarred and alive. They think we're success stories. I want to warn them, want to explain what they've signed themselves up for. But the administratum prefect is watching, and the guard arms men have weapons ready. So I stay silent. The new colonists are processed, assigned to HAB units, given orientation by the priests. They're told about the dangers, the adaptation period, the survival protocols. They're told casualties are within acceptable parameters. They're told the Emperor watches over the faithful. They're not told they're seeds. Genetic material being tested in the galaxy's most lethal environment. Some will die. Some will adapt. The adapted ones will breed children even better suited to Katashan. Those children will be harvested. The cycle continues. I watch a young man, maybe 20, lean and hive-pale, staring at the jungle beyond the perimeter with wide eyes. He reminds me of someone, takes me a moment to remember. Me. 317 years ago. That same expression of fear and hope mixed together. I approach him slowly. The new colonists are frightened of us. We don't look human to them anymore. First time off-world? I ask. My voice is rough, decades of barely speaking making the words awkward. He nods, not quite meeting my eyes. Yes, sir. Born in Hive Tertius on Morlock Prime, worked the plasma forges until... He stops, swallows. Until my father died. Took the colony option to give my younger brother a better chance at life. Every single word. The same story, the same motivation, the same lies. Morlock Prime, I say. Hive Tertius. I was born there. He looks at me then, surprise cutting through fear. Really? When? 317 years ago. He laughs nervously, thinks I'm joking, then sees my face and realizes I'm not. How? He whispers. How did you survive? I finish. You adapt or you die. Katashan changes you, your body, your mind, everything, until you're something that can exist here. Something that can't die even when you want to. He stares at the jungle, at the perimeter, at the other veterans moving through the compound with predatory grace. The orientation said the Emperor protects the faithful, he says quietly. That serving his will brings meaning to suffering. I could lie, could comfort him with the same propaganda we were fed, could let him discover the truth on his own the way I did. Instead, I tell him the truth. The Emperor is a corpse on a golden throne. He doesn't hear your prayers. He doesn't care that you exist. You were sent here because Katashan breeds perfect soldiers, and the Imperium needs perfect soldiers to feed its endless wars. You'll either die in the adaptation, most do, or you'll survive and change. If you survive, you'll have children. Those children will be even better adapted. When they're old enough, the Imperium will harvest them. Send them to war zones where they'll die. Then they'll send more colonists to breed the next batch. His face has gone pale. That's heresy. I'm the truth you'll learn anyway, I say. I'm just speeding up the process. You were lied to. We were all lied to. The colony is a farm. We're the crops. He looks like he might be sick, looks like his world has ended. Good, it has. Better to know it now. So what do I do? He asks. Voice small. Lost. Survive, I tell him. Because that's all there is. You survive. You adapt. You become what Katashan needs you to be. And if you're very unlucky, like me, you survive long enough to watch the cycle repeat forever. I walk away, leaving him standing there, his hope already dying. In a few weeks, his body will start changing. In a few months, he'll think differently. In a few years, he'll be teaching the next generation how to kill. In 300 years, if he's cursed enough, he'll stand where I stood and tell another frightened colonist the same truth. The cycle continues. Sometimes, in the spaces between teaching and surviving, I think about purpose, not meaning. I abandoned the search for meaning around year 140, but purpose, function. What role does Katashan serve in the Imperium's great machine? The answer is elegant in its cruelty. Katashan is a forge, not for weapons or ships or ammunition, for flesh, living, breathing, thinking flesh, shaped by evolutionary pressure into the perfect tool. Every death world in the Imperium serves this function. Send colonists, let the world kill the weak, take the strong. Repeat. It's more efficient than training. Natural selection does the work for you. The survivors are already hardened, already lethal, already conditioned to see death as routine. And the children are better. Each generation more adapted, more resilient, more perfectly suited to their hell world. By the third generation, they're barely human. By the 10th, they're living weapons. The Imperium doesn't maintain death worlds. It doesn't terraform them or make them safe. It preserves their lethality because that lethality is useful. Katashan's jungle isn't a problem to solve. It's a tool that solves problems. What problems? The Imperium's endless need for soldiers. Billions die every day across 1,000,000 worlds, fighting 1,000 wars against 1,000 enemies. Those soldiers need replacing. Where do you get tough, skilled, fearless troops in sufficient numbers? You grow them on worlds that kill anything less than exceptional. We are products. Our children are products. The colony isn't a community, it's a factory, and the jungle is the assembly line, and everyone who survives processing is shipped out to serve. The priests would call this the Emperor's divine plan. They'd say Katashan's children are blessed, chosen to serve in humanity's defense, their sacrifice made sacred by faith. But I've lived too long to believe in divine plans. There's nothing sacred about this. It's just efficient. Brutally, perfectly efficient. The false gods of the Imperium, the corpse emperor they worship, the machine spirits they pray to, the divine protection they promise, exist to make this efficiency palatable, to dress up harvesting humans in the language of duty and honor, to make us complicit in our own consumption. The Emperor protects, they taught me. But he doesn't. He can't. He's a corpse kept alive by machinery, and even if he were divine, he wouldn't care about individuals. The Imperium deals in populations, not people, statistics, not souls. We were expendable before we arrived. We remain expendable after adaptation. The only difference is we're more useful now. And the worst part, the thing that keeps me conscious through 317 years when I should have earned oblivion, is that I'm complicit. I perpetuate the cycle. I teach the children to survive so they can be harvested. I comfort the new colonists even though I know their purpose. I maintain the system because the alternative is letting everyone die, and I'm still human enough to fear that extinction. I'm a tool maintaining the machine that created me, a product that reproduces itself for consumption, and I can't stop because stopping means everyone dies. So I continue. The cycle continues. The green hell continues. The harvests continue. Forever. 317 years. I stand at the perimeter in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the jungle breathe. That's what it looks like from here. Breathing. The whole planet expanding and contracting, inhaling colonists and exhaling soldiers. My body is a monument to adaptation. I should have died at 70, 80, maybe 90 if I was lucky. Instead, I'm functionally immortal. Not by choice, but by mutation. My cells regenerate faster than they degrade. My organs are redundant, backed up by secondary systems. I could lose half my body and survive. Katashan made me perfect, perfectly trapped, perfectly aware of my own eternity. I've forgotten my father's name, forgotten my brother's face, forgotten what the hive smelled like, what manufactured food tasted like, what it felt like to be human. But I remember the promise, the poster I saw in the hive 317 years ago. Build a new world for the Emperor's glory, a future for your sons. I built nothing. My sons were harvested. Their sons were harvested. Their sons' sons were harvested. 10,000 descendants, maybe more. I lost count. They all died in wars I'll never hear about, on worlds I'll never see, for causes that never mattered. And I remain, teaching, surviving, perpetuating. Behind me, I hear footsteps. The new colonist, the one from Morlock Prime, the one whose story mirrors mine. He approaches cautiously, still frightened of me. Teacher Voss? His voice is young, unbroken by centuries. I've been thinking about what you said. About the cycle, about... He stops, starts again. If it's all meaningless, if we're just products, why do you keep teaching? Why not just stop? I look at him, see myself 317 years ago, asking the same question. Because they're children, I say, and if I don't teach them to survive, they'll die. Maybe it's meaningless. Maybe we're just breeding stock for the Imperium's wars. But while they're alive, while they're here, I can give them a few more years, a few more moments of existence before the harvest. That's not much? No, I agree. It's not. The sun rises. Katashan's bloated yellow sun, filtering through the canopy in diseased-looking rays. Another day, another cycle, another year closer to the next harvest. My name was Kalen Vross, I say to the young man. I was born in Hive Tertius on Morlock Prime. I came to Katashan believing in a better future. I was 19 years old and full of hope. I pause. Let the words settle. Remember that. When you've been here as long as I have, when you can't remember who you were, remember that I told you. I was human once. We all were. The young man nods slowly. He doesn't understand yet. But he will. In a few decades, when his body has changed beyond recognition. In a few centuries, when everyone he knew is dead and he's still teaching new colonists the same lessons. He'll understand, and the cycle will continue. I walk back toward the teaching grounds. More children are waiting, more lessons to give, more knowledge to pass on so they can survive long enough to be harvested. My name was Kalen Voss. I am the man who can't die. I am Katachan's perfect product, a teacher who perpetuates the system that consumed him. I am the eternal scream in the green hell. And 317 years from now, I will still be here, watching another transport descend, telling another frightened colonist the truth they won't want to hear. The Emperor doesn't protect. The prayers are empty. The purpose is service. The reward is death. And the jungle is always hungry. Always.